Everything had been planned. The lake, the guests, the flowers, even Clover's collar had tiny white blossoms sewn in. But something had been off all morning. He'd skipped breakfast, walked slower than usual, and now, just steps away from the altar, Clover refused to let Madeline go any further. What started as a perfect wedding day would become a turning point no one saw coming. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. The town of Timberlake, Oregon, nestled quietly by the shores of a glassy alpine lake, was dressed in early autumn gold. Pine needles carpeted the forest floor where Madeline Carter was to be married. The sun filtered gently through the towering evergreens, casting warm dapples on the wooden path that wound toward the lakeside altar. Pine-scented air clung to her skin as she stood in the clearing, bouquet trembling slightly in her hands, not from nerves, but from something deeper, something unspoken. Madeline Carter, 29, was a woman whose presence carried the kind of grace that didn't ask to be noticed. She was tall and willowy, with long auburn hair pinned in a loose braid that trailed over her shoulder. Her hazel eyes, soft but perceptive, often lingered longer on moments than most would think necessary. A florist by trade, her hands knew the language of gentleness. But beneath her serene exterior was a spine built of quiet resolve, shaped not just by years of running a flower shop alone, but by the grief of losing her mother to illness at 17, the age when most girls still asked how to braid their hair. By her side walked Clover. Clover was a 12-year-old golden retriever with fur the color of soft buttercream and eyes that shimmered with something older than time. His muzzle had begun to silver, and his gait was slower now, his steps careful on the uneven pine trail. Clover had come into Madeline's life on a rainy night during her sophomore year of college, a stray with matted fur and scared eyes that she found trembling behind the campus greenhouse. Since that night, he had never left her side. Through breakups, bad winters, business failures, and first kisses, Clover had remained the one unshaken presence in her life. Today, though, Clover's energy wasn't the same. He had refused breakfast that morning, which was unusual, and now, despite the crisp air and gentle slope, he paused more often. His breath shallow, his eyes flicking to Madeline with concern, as if he was the one checking on her. Madeline noticed, of course. She noticed everything about him, but she chalked it up to age and excitement. "You're okay, boy," she murmured, as she knelt to adjust his flower collar, a wreath of small daisies and eucalyptus she had twined herself. "It's a big day for both of us." The clearing buzzed softly with the sound of guests arriving and taking their seats on rows of rustic wooden benches. Ethan Brooks stood near the altar adjusting the cuffs of his shirt and running a hand through his short brown hair. At 31, Ethan had the clean-cut look of a man who ran a successful outdoor gear company with just enough scruff on his chin to say he still hiked the mountains he sold to. His navy suit was simple, and he wore his nervousness like a jacket one size too tight. Ethan glanced toward the trail. His jaw tensed not at the sight of Madeline, but at the figure who emerged from behind her. Logan Brooks. Logan was Ethan's older brother by 3 years, taller, broader in the shoulders, with darker unkempt hair and a beard that looked a week past trimming. He wore a charcoal vest over a faded dress shirt and jeans, not because he wanted to disrespect the event, but because that was just Logan. He had a quiet, almost brooding air to him, the kind shaped by years of traveling alone and staying out of family photos. There had been a rift years ago, never spoken of, but always felt. He had left home suddenly after their father's funeral, never quite returning in any full sense. Madeline had only met him twice before today. As he stepped into the light of the clearing, heads turned not just because of who he was, but because of what happened next. Clover, who had been standing faithfully at Madeline's heel, suddenly perked up. His ears shifted. He looked past Madeline, past the rows of guests, and locked eyes with Logan. Without a sound, Clover began walking toward him. Madeline turned in surprise. "Clover," she said softly, but the dog didn't stop. He limped slightly more pronounced now, but made his way to Logan, and with the deliberate grace of old age lay down at his feet, rested his head on Logan's shoe. The crowd murmured. Logan's brow furrowed, not in confusion, but something like recognition. He knelt slowly, resting a tentative hand on the dog's neck. "Hey there, old man," he murmured. Ethan's expression tightened. He turned back toward the lake hands, now clenched at his sides. Madeline approached Bouquet, now forgotten, at her side. "That's strange. Clover's never done that to anyone but me." Logan glanced up. "We've met before," he said quietly, "years ago, when you two first started dating. He followed me on a walk once when I left the house after a fight with Ethan. Sat next to me in the garage like he knew I needed it." "I didn't know that," Madeline said. Logan didn't answer. His fingers scratched gently behind Clover's ears. The dog let out a content sigh. For a long moment, no one moved. The sunlight filtered through the trees, catching on the strands of Madeline's veil and the graying hairs on Clover's back. It was as if the forest itself held its breath. And in that pause beneath the watching pines, something unspoken passed between the three of them. Madeline stood just beyond the pine clearing, her fingers trembling around the bouquet of white anemones and dusty millers she'd arranged herself the night before. From where she waited, she could hear the subtle hush fall over the gathered guests' rustling of silk, the shifting of shoes on pine needles, as if the entire forest had paused in reverence for the moment. The music had started a soft arrangement played by a local cellist named Claire Hammond, a tall, willowy woman in her late 50s with cropped silver hair and an expression that always hovered between serene and sorrowful. Claire had lived in Timberlake her whole life, and some said the quiet pain in her music came from losing her husband in a boating accident 20 years ago. Her melodies were mournful, but grounding, like someone remembering how to breathe. Madeline inhaled deeply and glanced down at Clover. He was beside her just as he always was. Except something was different. She took a tentative step forward toward the aisle that had been lined with pine cones and linen runners. Clover moved too, but not alongside her. Instead, he stepped directly in front of her, blocking her path. "Clover," she whispered, confused. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply stood there, unmoving, staring at her with eyes that held a weight far older than 12 years. His legs trembled ever so slightly, and his breathing was uneven, shallow puffs that barely stirred the fur on his chest. Madeline's heart squeezed. Behind her, the music faltered slightly as Claire caught sight of what was happening. Conversations dwindled into nothing, and a wave of silence swept through the crowd. Madeline knelt, not caring that her dress creased against the forest floor. "What is it, sweet boy?" she whispered, placing a gentle hand beneath Clover's chin. He leaned into her palm. His nose was dry. His gums looked pale. And that glimmer of youth, the mischief that had defined so much of their shared years, wasn't there. All that remained was a deep, almost urgent sadness. Ethan stepped forward from the altar, his brows drawing in concern. "Everything okay?" he called out, trying to keep his tone light. But Logan had already moved. He walked from his seat without hesitation, cutting through the aisle, his boots silent on the pine needles. When he reached them, he crouched beside Clover, one hand bracing the dog's shoulder. Clover didn't move away. He rested more of his weight on Logan, as if welcoming the familiar presence. "You all right, bud?" Logan murmured. He looked up at Madeline, his voice steady. I think he's trying to tell you something. Madeline's throat tightened. I thought it was just age, she said softly, but he's been tired all week. I figured the excitement of the wedding would pass. Logan said nothing at first. Then he shifted his gaze to Ethan, who now stood a few feet away, uncertainty etched across his face. Maybe, Logan said carefully, you need to take a step back for a moment. Look closer. Sometimes we rush toward what we think is most important and miss the thing that truly needs us. His words weren't cruel. They carried no venom, no resentment, just something quiet and grounded, shaped by whatever road he'd walked all these years alone. Ethan's shoulders stiffened. What are you implying, that I've made mistakes? Logan replied simply. And maybe I recognize one when I see it. A murmur passed through the guests. Claire had stopped playing altogether now. In the second row, an older woman, Ethan and Logan's Aunt Helen, a sharp-tongued widow known for her blunt honesty and layered pearl necklaces, whispered something to the man beside her, but even she looked taken aback by the scene. Madeline stood slowly unsure what to say, her bouquet now hanging forgotten by her side. Her eyes flicked between the two brothers, then down to Clover, who had now lowered himself to the forest floor, sides rising and falling in shallow rhythm. Ethan looked at Madeline. I didn't know he was this bad, he said softer now. Why didn't you say anything? Because I didn't know either, she admitted. I was so focused on today on making everything perfect, I missed it. Silence lingered like a fog. Then a new voice, gentle and clear, broke through. Maybe today doesn't need to be perfect, said Ruby Nolan Madeline's childhood friend and maid of honor. Ruby was a warm-faced woman with wild red curls and freckles like gold dust across her cheeks. She worked as a children's librarian and had a way of calming even the most chaotic situations skills, born from years of wrangling toddlers and healing from a difficult divorce that had nearly broken her spirit. But she came out stronger, softer in the right places, and steel in others. Ruby stepped forward, now placing a hand on Madeline's arm. Maybe today just needs to be real. Madeline's eyes burned. She looked at Ethan again, and this time he didn't look away. He walked toward her slowly, pausing only when he reached Clover's side. He knelt, something in him shifting, and gently stroked the dog's back. He's asking us for help, Ethan said, quietly. Logan, still crouched, nodded. He's still fighting, but not for long. Madeline dropped to her knees once more, pressing her forehead gently against Clover's. I'm here, she whispered. We're here. And as if to answer her, Clover let out the softest sigh. The tires crunched over gravel as the pickup swerved into the parking lot of Timber Lake Veterinary Clinic, a small low-roofed building set against the rise of the forest. The warm glow from its windows spilled out into the dusk, casting a golden light on the wet pavement. Inside the cab, the air was thick with silence and shallow breathing, not just from the humans but from Clover curled in Madeline's lap, his chest rising with quiet urgency. Madeline sat with the skirt of her wedding dress tangled beneath Clover's weight, one hand cradling his head, the other buried in the golden waves of his fur. Her face, framed by tendrils of loose auburn hair, was pale, but her expression held steady. Her fingers didn't stop moving, tracing slow circles on his shoulder, even as her heart begged the moment to freeze. Ethan gripped the wheel tighter. His usually composed face, clean-shaven and deliberate, now betrayed the undercurrent of panic he was working to hide. Almost there, he murmured. Logan sat in the backseat, arms resting on his knees, watching the two in the front with an unreadable expression. The last time he'd ridden in the same car with Ethan, they were teenagers. An awkward silence had always stretched between them since then, long before today. The front door to the clinic opened before they even stepped out. Dr. Hal Peterson emerged, already shrugging on his stethoscope. In his late 60s, Dr. Peterson was a man of deliberate motion, with thinning silver hair glasses that always slid down his nose, and a presence that made animals calm the moment he entered a room. He had known Clover since he was rescued, had given him his first shots, removed a fishhook from his paw once, and sent Madeline birthday cards from Clover for years as a joke. "I saw the call," he said, voice gentle but laced with urgency. "Bring him in." Ethan rushed to open the door. Madeline stepped out carefully, lifting Clover with surprising strength despite the weight of her dress and her trembling arms. She followed Dr. Peterson inside her veil, catching on the clinic's doorframe and fluttering to the floor like a discarded curtain. Inside, the walls smelled of antiseptic and cedar. The waiting room was empty, the lights dimmed to evening hours save for one vet tech, Camille, a young freckled woman in scrubs, barely 22, who looked up in wide-eyed surprise. She said nothing, just moved quickly to prepare the back room. Dr. Peterson led them to the exam table and patted it gently. "Let's take a look." Madeline laid Clover down slowly, whispering to him the whole time. He didn't resist, only sighed and pressed his nose into her palm. Logan stayed back, leaning against the wall, arms folded, watching everything. As Dr. Peterson ran his hands over Clover's ribs and listened to his heartbeat, the silence grew heavy. Finally, he looked up, removing the stethoscope slowly. "There's fluid in the lungs," he said. "The heartbeat's irregular. I've seen this before. It's advanced heart failure." The words hit like falling glass. Madeline blinked, then reached for Clover's paw. "How long?" Ethan asked, voice already fraying at the edges. Dr. Peterson hesitated. "If we're lucky, months. With medication and low stress, he could have more time. But it won't be years." Madeline nodded once. "Is he in pain?" "No," the vet said gently. "But he was trying to tell you something. Blocking your path, that was him asking for help." Her hand shook as she laid it over Clover's chest. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Dr. Peterson placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder before quietly exiting, giving them space. Ethan sat down on the bench near the wall, head in his hands. "I should have known," he murmured. "I should have seen it too." Logan remained quiet. His eyes locked on Clover, but eventually he spoke. He's always known how to bring people together. Ethan looked up. "Remember the storm?" Logan asked. Ethan blinked, then slowly nodded. It had been a summer storm nearly 15 years ago. They were camping with their parents by the lake when the lightning cracked too close, and Clover, barely a pup, had bolted from the tent. The boys had gone after him without thinking through the woods, shouting and soaked. They found him shaking under the old bridge, wedged in the roots of a fallen tree. It had taken both of them to coax him out to carry him home in their jackets. "That was the first time we worked together," Logan said, eyes distant. "And maybe the last." "You left right after Dad died," Ethan replied. "I did," Logan said simply. "But not because of you. Because I couldn't stay and be a shadow of him." Ethan swallowed hard. "You never told me that. I didn't know how." The brothers sat there years, folding quietly between them. Madeline looked up at them from beside the table. Her voice was steady but soft. "He brought you both here for a reason. If this is the last time he gets to choose what matters, it wasn't the ceremony. It was this." Neither man spoke. But for the first time in years, there was no tension in the room. Only quiet understanding. In the hallway, Camille passed by, slowly giving a polite nod. She had once adopted a stray tabby cat Madeline fostered and had always looked up to her. Her eyes flicked to the dog on the table, and she swallowed hard before ducking into another room. Back inside, Clover shifted and let out a long, low breath. Madeline pressed her forehead to his and whispered, "We'll take you home soon, okay?" Logan looked toward Ethan. "We don't have to go back to the ceremony." Ethan nodded. No, I think we need to figure out what really matters tonight. The soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead blended with the gentle ticking of the wall clock inside Timberlake Veterinary Clinic. Time had lost its urgency here. It no longer moved with ceremony cues or orchestral timing, but with the breath of an old dog lying quietly on a medical blanket. Clover's eyes were half closed, his tail giving the occasional slow wag as if acknowledging each new presence that entered the room with tired familiarity. Madeline sat on the floor beside him, her wedding dress slightly wrinkled and speckled with fur. Her veil had been set aside, draped over the back of a plastic chair. Her hands never stopped moving, adjusting Clover's blanket, smoothing the folds of his collar, stroking between his eyes where the fur had grayed most. The back room of the clinic had been transformed in less than an hour. Camille, the young vet tech with freckles and a quiet determination, had strung soft white string lights around the upper cabinets. Dr. Peterson had cleared the counter space and arranged chairs in a half circle, shaking his head with half a smile, as he muttered something about firsts in 40 years of practice. Outside, the autumn sky deepened into indigo, and one by one, the guests who had once waited at the lake made their way here. Aunt Helen arrived first, her pearls clinking as she stepped in with surprising grace for a woman in her 70s. She gave Madeline a single nod and a tissue. Then came Claire, the cellist, still carrying her instrument hair pinned tighter than before, but with eyes that shimmered. She offered to play during the vows, and no one argued. Ruby appeared next, breathless, but radiant, still wearing her dusty blue maid of honor dress and holding Madeline's bouquet like it was made of porcelain. "This is the most beautiful disaster I've ever seen," she whispered before, pulling Madeline into a careful hug. Ethan stood near the room's doorway, watching each new arrival with growing gratitude. He had removed his jacket and rolled his sleeves, a gesture that made him look more himself. Beside him stood Logan, now silent but not withdrawn. For the first time since the ceremony had paused, the two brothers looked like they belonged in the same room. Logan held a small square box in his palm. Madeline noticed. "You still have the rings?" she asked, her voice soft. He nodded and walked over, opening the box to reveal the gold bands nestled inside. Logan Brooks had never been a sentimental man. Life had taught him not to expect things to last, but today, holding these rings, something shifted. He looked at his brother and handed him one of the bands with an expression that said far more than words ever could. Ethan met his gaze. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan simply said, "Thanks." The room hushed as Dr. Peterson stepped forward. He had removed his white coat and stood now in a sweater vest and pressed shirt, holding a small weathered Bible that had belonged to his late wife. "Madeline, Ethan," he began, voice steady, "this won't be the wedding you planned, but it may be the one you remember most." Madeline stood and took Ethan's hand. They faced each other in front of the exam table, Clover at their feet. The dog shifted slightly, let out a low huff of air, and gently placed his head near Madeline's shoe. Claire began to play softly from the corner, just a single cello weaving through the stillness. The ceremony was short. The vows were spoken not as grand declarations, but as whispered promises. Ethan's hands trembled as he slid the ring onto Madeline's finger. Madeline's voice caught as she repeated the words that bound them, not because she was nervous, but because the weight of meaning had never felt clearer. When Dr. Peterson pronounced them husband and wife, there was no applause, only the sound of Clover's tail gently thudding once then again against the linoleum floor. A few people laughed. Most wept. Ruby dabbed at her eyes with Ethan's discarded pocket square. Aunt Helen held her hand to her chest, and even Claire's playing trembled slightly, as if emotion had crept into the strings. Clover opened his eyes once more, watching them both with the same quiet devotion he'd given for over a decade. Logan stepped forward with the rings box still in hand. "Guess I'm officially part of a miracle now," he said dryly, though there was warmth in his tone. He gave Madeline a small smile. He chose well. Madeline looked down at Clover. He always did. After the ceremony, the guests didn't rush out. Instead, they lingered. Some shared stories about Clover, how he once caught a squirrel in his mouth and then let it go with apparent guilt. How he'd learned to open cabinet doors and once stole an entire roast chicken from a Thanksgiving dinner. Ruby reminisced about a summer day when Clover had led a group of children away from a beehive in the park like a fluffy little shepherd. Logan and Ethan stood near the window, quiet. "I think Dad would have liked this," Logan said. Ethan smiled faintly. "I think he'd have called it ridiculous and cried the whole time." They both laughed genuinely this time. No bitterness, just memory. As the evening wound down, Madeline sat once again beside Clover. She whispered to him while stroking his paw, her wedding band catching the overhead light. "You stayed just long enough," she said, and for a brief moment Clover's tail moved again, a single beat that felt like a blessing. The late March sky hung over Timberlake, like a soft watercolor washlight blue, brushed with whispers of pink. The earth had begun to warm again, coaxing early crocuses from the soil and loosening the last frost from the pine needles. Spring had tiptoed into the forest gently, and the morning of Clover's farewell was no different. It was the kind of day he would have loved. Clover had passed peacefully at home. Madeline had woken early to find him curled by the hearth, his breathing slow, but even his tail giving a final faint thump against the hardwood floor as she knelt beside him. Ethan had joined her moments later, kneeling on the other side. Together, they whispered their thank yous and I love yous, while the sun crept gently into the room. When Clover took his last breath, it felt less like an ending and more like a boo, an old soul returning to stillness. The days that followed were quiet, but not hollow. His collar remained by the door, his favorite blanket folded on the couch. There was grief, of course. The kind that comes in waves, unexpected and insistent. But there was peace, too. Clover had left them surrounded by love, and they carried it with them. One Saturday morning, Madeline stood in front of the same shelter where she had first met Clover 12 years ago. The Timberlake Animal Haven was a small building, nestled at the edge of town, painted pale yellow with ivy creeping up one side. The new sign out front, recently refurbished by a volunteer carpenter named Ellis, an older man with kind eyes and a permanent pencil behind his ear, read, "Every tale deserves a second chapter." Ethan stepped out of the car behind her, wrapping an arm around her shoulder. "You sure?" he asked. "I'm not looking to replace him," she said softly. "But I think there's room." They entered the shelter to the familiar jingle of a bell. Behind the desk sat Maria Santos, the shelter manager. Maria was in her early 40s with shoulder-length dark curls, a petite frame, and the kind of voice that never needed to be raised to be heard. She wore worn jeans, hiking boots, and a zip-up hoodie with paw prints on the sleeves. Maria had been working there since her 20s and had a reputation in town as someone who could calm any animal and any person if given 5 minutes and a warm cup of tea. She stood as they entered, smiling softly. "Welcome back, Mrs. Brooks." "Mr. Brooks." "It's Madeline," she said with a chuckle. "Still not used to that." Maria's eyes softened. "I heard about Clover. I'm so sorry. He was one of the special ones. They're all special." Madeline replied, then paused. "But yes, he was." Maria gestured for them to follow her. "We've got a few rescues who might be a good match. I know you're not in a rush, so take your time. There's someone I think you should meet." She led them through the kennels where the soft hum of wagging tails and curious eyes followed them. There were young pups and old souls alike, each one pressing up against their gates with cautious hope. Ethan stopped now and then to greet a particularly eager nose or wagging tail. At the very end of the row in a quieter corner was a small enclosure with a sign that read, Fern, Golden Retriever Mix, approx. 5 months. Fern was curled on a tattered blanket, her golden fur still a bit patchy in places where it had begun to grow back after malnourishment. Her ears were slightly oversized for her face, giving her a perpetually curious expression. As Madeline approached, Fern lifted her head slowly and blinked up at her with eyes that held none of the fear Madeline had expected, but something more akin to recognition. Their eyes met, and Madeline froze. Ethan said nothing. He didn't need to. Fern stood, stretched her front legs, and padded over to the gate. She sat and looked up at them, not barking, not whining, just waiting. Madeline knelt and reached through the bars. Fern leaned in, and just like that, something opened. Later that week, Fern came home. She stepped cautiously into the house, sniffing every corner, her tail slowly uncurling from between her legs. She paused at the fireplace where Clover had slept, sniffed his blanket, and then laid down beside it, curling into a warm, loose ball. Madeline sat nearby and wept, not from pain, but from the joy of realizing she could love again. Around the same time, Logan moved into a small cottage just 2 blocks down from theirs. It had a wraparound porch, a slanted roof, and a big fenced backyard that he immediately filled with tools and half-finished carpentry projects. After the wedding, he'd stayed longer than planned, helping Madeline build a planter box for her flower shop, and one day simply never left. Timberlake had room for him again, and so did his brother. With Ethan's business skills, Madeline's heart for rescue, and Logan's hands-on practicality, the 3 of them co-founded the Hollow Hearth, a non-profit center dedicated to elderly, terminally ill, or special needs pets. The first resident was a blind tabby cat named Thimble, found under a porch, and known to swipe playfully at anyone who rustled a chip bag. The second was a 3-legged beagle named Otis, who howled in harmony with Ruby's guitar during her weekend visits. The home was never quiet, never pristine, but it was full of life. One Sunday evening, as the golden light stretched across the living room floor, Madeline sat beside Fern on the rug, brushing out her newly full coat. Ethan was reading on the couch. Logan had just dropped off a repaired birdhouse and left a pie from Aunt Helen, who had surprisingly warmed to the idea of all these animals with medical bills. Fern leaned into Madeline's side and let out a long, satisfied sigh. "She's different from Clover," Ethan said. Madeline nodded. "Yes, and exactly who she needs to be." She looked out the window where the stars had begun to prick through the indigo sky. Love had come again, not as a replacement, but as a continuation. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't arrive with thunder or light. They come on quiet mornings in the soft breath of an old dog, in the second chance offered by a frightened puppy, or in the healing of a broken bond between 2 brothers. This story reminds us that love doesn't end when someone we cherish leaves. It transforms, multiplies, and gently leads us toward new beginnings. We believe that Clover wasn't just a loyal companion. He was a gentle messenger sent to remind us that God's grace often works through the lives of the smallest, furriest angels. Through him, Madeline and Ethan found not only each other but also a calling greater than themselves. Logan found his way home, and a little pup named Fern found a family. In your own life, maybe you're waiting for a miracle. Maybe you've lost something dear, or you're afraid to open your heart again. But God works in quiet, surprising ways through wagging tails, warm sunsets, and people who show up when we least expect them. All we have to do is be willing to open our hearts. If this story touched you, we invite you to share it with someone who might need it today. Leave a comment below and type Amen if you believe that love, guided by faith, always finds its way home. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and may God bless you and your loved ones with peace healing and little miracles of your own.